So we saw the RESTful service on the server. We need a client to talk to that service, written in React. Right? So here we're going to focus on the React REST client that talks to the REST controller through AJAX over HTTP. Right? So internally it's going to have some methods that allow it for you to be able to call it from your React component as you click and drag and interact with the user interface. We'll call these functions createQuote, updateQuote, or deleteQuote, right, on the REST client. And the REST client will then generate programmatically posts, puts, and deletes for each one of these methods, by passing along any JSON object that represents the new quote or updates on an existing quote, or deleting a particular quote of a particular ID that go out to the REST controller that's listening for these posts, puts, and deletes. So let's see the implementation. The implementation is using the design pattern, the Singleton design pattern, which probably that's what we did a couple weeks ago. So that's nothing new there. Right, so it's just using a static instance. And then you might already have in there implemented in the last couple of weeks. You might have implemented already some finder methods, find all or find by ID. So you already should have that. So that's nothing new here, right? These all use fetch. By default, these are gets that go out and fetch a particular element by its ID, or retrieve all the instances, and they retrieve, they send back, or here this is an implicit return. This is using the new version of JavaScript, ES6, where there's an implicit return here that goes out to whoever is calling this, and then using response.json to parse the JSON object into a JSON object, a JSON string into a JSON object. In createQuote is implemented slightly different. Notice that there's a deleteQuote.id there. See that? That's making sure that whatever object I am creating brand new does not have an ID, right? Because that ID would be interpreted by JPA. Right? JPA would interpret that ID saying, "Oh, there's an ID, so this must be mapped to some existing record." Right? So if by mistake I have an ID there, I would confuse JPA, right? Saying if this is an ID, it must be some record that you're updating. Instead, I want to make sure there is no ID or it's undefined, so that JPA will interpret this as creating a new instance, right, and doing an insert as opposed to an update. So here I am explicitly deleting a quote.id, and then I'm sending a JSON post as opposed to a get. So here the fetch by default is a get. So if you want to use anything other than a get, you have to explicitly provide a configuration object. Here we're saying that the method is a post. We're sending some data across. We're going to convert it from a JSON object into a string, right? And we're going to tell the server that I am sending a string that is formatted in a JSON format, so that they'll know to interpret the string as not just any string. It's a formatted string in the JSON format. This eventually will come back to the server with the new instance that was inserted into the database, right? And we can then send it back to the client, whoever's using this. One thing to point out here: notice that there's a curly bracket at the beginning there, and a curly bracket that ends over here. Right. Also notice that I have an explicit return, right? Whereas in the other ones I didn't have an explicit return. That's just it's a language, JavaScript language idiosyncrasy, that if you in these two cases, right, the fetch was the only function being invoked here, right? And so notice that it has no curly brackets. And so what this is, the way this is interpreted is that this is an implicit return. It's returning whatever the fetch is returning. It's returning it to whoever calls this, right? So it's implicit. Here, because I have two lines of code, the delete and then the fetch, right? I need to put it inside of a curly bracket. If it were a single function, then the curly brackets would be optional. But because it's two lines of code, I need to put it inside of a curly bracket. And when I do that, I lose the the implicit return. So here I have to have an explicit return, that this function explicitly returns whatever the fetch returns, so that I can use it as the promise for whoever's using this. Here the update, notice that the update does not have a curly bracket, and it doesn't have an explicit return. So again, this is an implicit return of whatever the fetch returns. Same thing, right? Instead of it's not a get. Instead, I am configuring this to be a put, because that's what the controller is expecting, right? It's expecting a put. It's expecting also a string formatted as a JSON string, and from where we're going to parse out and instantiate the quote on the server side. And what I would get back is the object having been updated. And finally, the delete, right? Again, it's an implicit return, doesn't have curly brackets. It's just notice that it has no body, no contents, no anything. It's just saying that the method is a delete, not a get, right? So this generates a delete all the way to the server, and the server then removes it from it. Notice that I'm not even parsing anything that comes back from the server. The server is just returning something void. Okay. So again, this is the service on the React side.